My name is Usman Kabir. I'm 38 years old, and as difficult as it is to admit today, for many years I was proud to consider myself a Hamas fighter. I say this not with joy, but with a heavy heart. I share this story not because it's easy to tell. On the contrary, it's one of the hardest things I've ever, but because silence is often a crueler prison than any cell with bars. And I've lived inside this invisible prison for far too long. I grew up believing this was the only possible reality, but today, I know there is another way, and that's what I want to talk to you about. I was born in Gaza City, in a small apartment that barely housed all my family members. The space was so cramped that we often had to take turns sleeping comfortably. The walls were so thin that we could clearly hear the muffled arguments and desperate sighs of our neighbors. My earliest memories are simple but striking. My father's voice reciting verses from the Quran at dawn, the smoke of black tea mingling with the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen, and the crackling of the old radio broadcasting, almost always, news about jihad and the fight against Israel. It was as if, from my first steps, my identity had already been written. I was Muslim, I was Palestinian, and my mission, they said, was to defend Islam at any cost, even with my life, if necessary. Childhood in my neighborhood was, on the surface, like any other child's. But there, instead of playing ball or hide-and-seek, our games mimicked the war that surrounded us. We fashioned rifles from pieces of wood, tied green headbands around our heads, and shouted the same slogans that echoed from the mosque loudspeakers. Violence was normalized, as if it were part of the air we breathed. By age 7, I could already recite Surah Al-Fatiha and the first verses of Surah Al-Baqarah perfectly. My father was visibly proud when he saw me praying beside him. My mother would stroke my head tenderly and say, "You will be a strong man for Allah, my son." Everything around me, at school, on the streets, at home, told me that the greatest nobility lay in total surrender to Islam and its armed defense. I believed. I never stopped to question it. How could I doubt something that had been confirmed by everyone I loved? When I turned 19, I was officially recruited into Hamas. I remember that muggy day clearly, when the dust from the demolition of a building still hung in the air, making it difficult to even see clear. 2 men approached me after Friday prayer. Their voices were firm but not raised. They spoke with quiet authority. They said they had observed my dedication, my discipline, my commitment to faith. They affirmed that I had a higher calling, a chance to honor my parents, to protect my people, and to serve Allah in a way few could. I didn't hesitate. It felt like the fulfillment of the destiny I had been taught since childhood. From that moment on, my life changed completely. I entered an intense cycle of training, missions, and total fidelity to the cause. We lived like brothers in arms. We shared the same food, slept side by side on the hard floor, kept secrets that could never be told outside our circle. It was as if we were a single soul divided between many bodies. But even back then, when my faith in the mission was almost blind, small doubts began to appear, like thin cracks in a seemingly solid wall. I vividly remember an operation we were called to in a hurry. It was night, the atmosphere tense, and everything happened too quickly. In the midst of the action, a boy, he must have been about 8 years old, came running, lost, scared, not understanding what was happening. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The mission leader shouted an order that, to this day, echoes in my ears, and I obeyed. Because in that world, hesitation was almost like death. Obedience was seen as a virtue, a sign of faith. That night passed, and I tried to convince myself that it was necessary, part of something greater. But when I lay down, even exhausted, that boy's face wouldn't leave me alone. I began to realize there was something broken inside me, even if I couldn't yet name it. Life went on. I married Amina, a woman from Khan Yunis with a sweet heart, deep brown eyes, and a laugh that was like a balm in the midst of chaos. With her, I felt for the first time that perhaps there was something. We had 2 daughters, Salma and Noura, and from the moment they were born, my entire world changed. Those 2 little beings brought color to an existence that, until then, had been painted in black and green, the colors of struggle and Hamas. Salma loved to draw. She would spend hours immersed in paper and crayons, creating impossible landscapes with gardens, flowers, and plain-free skies. Noor was closer to me. She was my little shadow, always clinging to my finger, asking me, "Baba, where do you go when you leave the house?" I never had the courage to tell the truth. I always responded with some soft lie, saying I was helping others. And, in a way, I wanted to believe it myself. But inside, unease grew. It was a strange feeling, as if something inside me was slowly waking up, making me realize that maybe all of this wasn't what it seemed. It wasn't doubt. At least, it wasn't yet. It was something deeper, more insatiable, a hunger. But not a hunger for food, nor for knowledge. It was a kind of emptiness that none of the 5 daily prayers could fill. I would kneel on my prayer mat, say the Shahada with complete devotion, recite every verse of the Quran I knew by heart, and in the end, all I felt was a dry silence inside me, an uncomfortable silence. On the outside, everything seemed in order. Firm faith, constant practice. But inside, something was broken. I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue, that maybe I was just overwhelmed by responsibility. But the truth was, my heart seemed to be trying to say something my mind refused to accept. It was like a constant muffled whisper, begging for something more, something I couldn't yet name. I want to be honest with you, even knowing the risk I run in speaking all this. Telling my story isn't just difficult, it's dangerous. There are people who would hate me for even uttering these words, people who would end my life if they knew what I'm saying here. But even so, I choose to speak. And I don't speak out of anger. I don't speak out of revenge. I speak because the truth, when hidden, rots. And I've spent too long suffocating inside a lie. I know you may have come this far by accident. Perhaps you clicked on this video out of curiosity. Or perhaps you're doubting everything I'm saying. Maybe you're Muslim, secretly, are beginning to ask the questions I once feared asking. Or perhaps you're Christian, and want to understand what it truly costs to follow Jesus in a place like Gaza. Whatever your reason, don't listen to this as a bystander. I speak from one human being to another, from someone who has walked dark paths and found light where they least expected it. So, if this story touches you in any way, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear something like this. And if you can, leave a comment. Not for me, but for so many stories like mine. Stories that live hidden in the shadows, waiting for just a ray of light to reach someone who thinks they're alone. This is just the beginning of my journey. A beginning marked by losses and twists I could never have imagined. Because soon, everything I thought was true, everything I believed in with all my soul, would be swallowed by the deepest pain. And in that moment, I wouldn't just lose my family, I would lose the faith that had shaped my identity since birth. I can still feel the wind from that night, a strange, cutting wind that whispered through the narrow alleys of Gaza, as if carrying the unheard cries of an entire people, and the weight of secrets I wished I'd never discovered. It all began like an ordinary evening. I had returned from a meeting with my unit, tired, yes, but happy to be home. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread, and the sweet aroma of Amina's cakes made the small apartment a haven from the chaos outside. Salma sat by the window, her colored pencils scattered around, the last golden light of dusk painting her drawings. Noura was on my lap, her little hands tugging hard on my beard, laughing loudly every time I made a different face. In those moments, the war seemed distant, as if it were part of another world. In that moment, I wasn't a fighter. I wasn't a Hamas agent. I was just their Baba, a father trying to preserve his daughter's joy, even amidst the ruins. But peace in Gaza, it's like thin glass, always on the verge of shattering. And that night, it shattered completely. 3 violent knocks on the door shattered our fragile peace. They weren't polite knocks. They were heavy, sharp knocks, the kind that makes your stomach churn before your mind can process the danger. Amina looked straight into my eyes, and without saying a word, she told me fear, foreboding. I walked to the door, trying to hide the tension in my steps. When I opened it, I saw 3 men, armed, hard, with steely gazes. I recognized them immediately. They weren't strangers. Quite the opposite. They were men who had marched beside me, with whom I'd shared meals, prayers, and trenches. Brothers in arms, or at least, that's what I believed them. The leader stepped forward, with the posture of someone who had already decided the outcome long before that night. He didn't look me in the eye when he spoke. He simply said, "Usman, come with us now." It wasn't an invitation, nor an ordinary order. It was a sentence, a cold verdict with no chance of appeal. I turned to Amina, who was still holding Noura in her arms, and tried to smile, as if it were a normal exit. "I'll be right back." That was all I could manage. But Amina felt it. She always felt. She gripped my arm tightly, her eyes pleading. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. I didn't have the courage. The silent lie seemed, at that moment, the only way to protect her. Or perhaps I was trying to protect myself from the truth. They escorted me to a van parked a few meters from our door. No one spoke during the ride. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the dull thud of rifles hitting the metal walls of the vehicle, like clocks ticking down. My mind raced, searching for answers before the facts overwhelmed me. Had the last mission failed? Had someone betrayed us? Or did they think you was it the traitor? It was hard to know. In the world we lived in, the line between guilt and rumor was razor thin, and all it took was for someone to believe it, and punishment was meted out without hesitation. The van stopped abruptly in an empty, isolated lot, shrouded in darkness. I was shoved out roughly, my feet stumbling in the soft sand. There was only a lamp hanging from a makeshift wire, casting a dim light on the scene before me. And then I saw it. A freshly dug hole in the dry earth. Beside it, two small, motionless bodies. My chest tightened, my breath caught, as if my own body refused to accept what it saw. I still couldn't be sure with my eyes, but my soul already. It was them, my daughters, Salma and Noura, lying there as if they were. The leader spoke with a coldness that still gives me chills. A message needed to be sent. He didn't tremble, didn't hesitate. We were told you passed information to the enemy, that you betrayed your brothers. You brought shame to us all. His voice was stone. Someone like you doesn't deserve to live, but we decided you should understand the price of betrayal before you die. I tried to speak, my mouth open, but my voice came out in a hoarse, distorted sound I barely recognized as my own. I screamed their names. They are children, my daughters. One of the men looked away, visibly shaken. Another shifted uncomfortably, as if he wanted to disappear. But the leader? He remained motionless, icy. They will be martyrs. The Americans. The whole world will know what happens to traitors. I tried to run to them, but two rifles dug into my chest, preventing me from moving. I could feel the vibration of my heart beating against the cold metal. My knees buckled, begging to fall, but they held me upright by force, as if forcing me to watch the destruction of my own world. And I watched, eyes wide open, unable to look away. The earth beside the grave was already loose, still fresh from the digging. They moved my daughters' bodies as if they were objects, broken, lifeless dolls. They laid them side by side with a silent brutality that cut deeper than screams. Salma's eyes were still open, staring blankly. She wasn't breathing. Noor's little hand was clenched, her fingers small and hard as stone. I prayed for an impossible miracle. I prayed that it was all a mistake, that they were simply unconscious. But no one there had the decency to offer me even an explanation, a gesture of compassion. The sound of the shovel shoveling dirt over them was the most violent sound I'd ever heard. Each blow of dirt was like a hammer blow to my heart. Each time the earth fell, a piece of me died too. And in that exact moment, something inside me shattered forever. It wasn't just my father's heart it was my faith, my worldview. Everything I'd been taught since childhood, about mercy, about justice, about brotherhood, crumbled like a sandcastle, a cruel storm. I'd always been told that Allah was just, that he was compassionate, that fellow believers would protect each other to the end. But there they were, the same men I'd fought side by side with, murdering my daughters. In the name of God, in the name of religion. I felt a rage I never thought I could bear, a blind urge to scream until I lost my voice, to rip the weapons from their hands and take justice into my own hands. But I couldn't. My body was shaking so hard it felt like it was falling apart. My throat was dry as stone. My mind was a hurricane of questions no one would ever answer. When they were done, they left me there, without ceremony, without explanation. And before they left, the leader spoke his last words, words that still burn in my memory. Pray for your souls, men. Perhaps Allah will forgive you. He will not. And with that, they turned and disappeared into the darkness, like shadows. I remained there, kneeling before the still loose earth, my hands trembling, my eyes fixed on that mound that covered everything I loved. I began to repeat their names softly. Salma, Noor, Salma, Noor, as if saying their names could bring them back. As if saying their names were a way of denying what had just happened. The night wore on, and the cold seeped into my bones, but I did not move. The call to Aisha prayer sounded in the distance, coming from a mosque I used to frequent. I tried to stand, tried to recite the Shahada, but the words faded from my mouth like ashes blown away by the wind. For the first time in my life, I could not pray. For the first time I wondered if Allah was truly listening, or if you ever were. I staggered home in the early hours of the morning, like a man who no longer belonged anywhere. Every step I took seemed to take me further away from the life I knew. When I pushed open the apartment door, the silence hit me like a punch. Amina was gone. Nouray's crib was empty. Salma's clothes, folded on the chair, were exactly where I'd left them, but she wasn't there, only emptiness. Later I learned that Amina had been rushed to her family's village. They said it was for her safety, but deep down they knew it was to protect her from the pain that enveloped me. I was completely alone, not just in the apartment, but in my soul, alone in what had once been my faith. I sat in silence for hours, with the light off, staring at the wall as if waiting for her to say something. The images came like broken echoes. Salma's last drawing on the table, Noura's hand clutched in mine, the gaping hole in dark and cruel. That night, in the midst of that deafening silence, I made a wordless vow. If this was Islam, then I no longer wanted to be a part of it. But at the same time, without Islam, what was left of me? It was the night the ground beneath my feet gave way. At the time, I thought it was just a personal loss, but looking back, I see that it was there that something greater happened. An invisible crack opened between me and the religion that had shaped my identity since birth. The wall separating me from the true God began to crumble. The days following my daughter's burial were hazy. Time lost its structure. Hours existed only as spaces between internal torments. I didn't eat, I didn't sleep, and, most strikingly, I didn't pray. The call to prayer echoed through the streets of Gaza 5 times a day, as always, but unlike before, when I would run to the sound of the adhan to perform wudu with reverence. Now I simply remained motionless, sitting, silent, with my eyes lost. It wasn't just pain, it was betrayal, a profound betrayal, one that came not just from men, but from the very belief that sustained me. A wound that struck not only my heart, but the very ground on which I had built my faith. And at night, the ghosts returned, not just the memories of my girls, their laughter, the drawings, the tight hugs, but also all the years I'd served Hamas zealously, believing my devotion was sanctity. I thought of the pride I'd felt wearing the green headband, a symbol of honor. Now, it seemed like a curse. I remembered my first training session, the stifling heat, the smell of sweat and gunpowder, the adrenaline rush of shouts in unison, Allahu Akbar, until our throats ached. They said that killing Allah's enemies was the noblest act, that blood shed for this cause was a direct ticket to paradise, that martyrs would be received with honor, with pristine rivers awaiting them. And I believed all of this, with the blind faith of a 19-year-old who wanted to honor his faith. But now, I would trade all the supposed pleasures of Jannah for another night with Salma asking me for a story, or Noor pulling my beard while laughing. Over time, I began to see something I'd previously refused to see. The contradictions in the Quran, which I'd previously accepted without question, began to bother me. For years, I'd memorized verses that spoke of Allah's mercy. Allah is forgiving, merciful, I repeat. But I also knew by heart the verses that spoke of death for anyone who left Islam, that commanded violence against infidel. I'd never questioned it before. I took it for granted. I believed mercy was only for those inside, that everyone else, those who thought differently, deserved punishment. But what about when the one who kills you says they serve the same God as you? And when believers themselves bury their children and still claim to be righteous? Something no longer made sense. The book that had once been my foundation now felt like a maze of lifeless words. I picked up the Quran ran my fingers over the letters that had once given me comfort, and realized I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to hear anything else from it. Not for fear of forgetting what was written, but for fear of remembering. The mosque, once a refuge, became a place I instinctively avoided. Whenever I passed by, it was as if an invisible wall prevented me from entering. I heard the imam's voice, strong, firm, repeating the same old speeches. Jihad, honor, enemies. Words I'd heard so many times that they'd once seemed beautiful, now sounded poisonous. Poisoned by the pain they... Within me, a silent war began to form. A part of me still said, without Islam, you are nothing. You will be lost. But another part screamed back, it was Islam that took everything from you. Your daughters, your wife, your soul. And among these voices, there in the midst of the conflict, I began to hear something new, a different silence, an empty space that no longer hurt the same way, but that seemed to be opening to something I didn't yet understand, something that, later I would discover, was the beginning of a calling. One night, when the weight of silence seemed to crush the walls around me, I found myself alone in the small room where I used to keep my prayer rug. It was the same place where, for years, I had knelt devoutly, seeking to feel the presence of Allah. The air inside was dense, almost still, as if even time refused to enter. The green rug, carefully folded in a corner, seemed to stare at me. That object had been my refuge, my link to the divine since adolescence. I picked it up with trembling hands and spread it on the floor. I sat on it. I knelt, my forehead pressed against the worn fabric. I tried to whisper Bismillah, but the words wouldn't come. They stuck in my throat like stones. And then the tears came. They weren't contained, silent tears. They were violent sobs, the kind that shake the entire body, that tear at the chest, that tear the air from the lungs. I cried like never before, and when the crying finally stopped, I sat there staring at the rug, a symbol that no longer meant anything to me. At that moment, a question rose within me like a storm. What kind of God accepts the blood of children as an offering? What kind of God demands obedience from men who bury the innocent with their own hands, and then claim to be doing God's will? I looked at that rug, my companion of 2 decades, and felt nothing but revulsion. Something inside me hardened, as if the last wall had collapsed. I stood up slowly. I folded the rug one last time. I left the room and walked down to the alley behind the building, my steps heavy, my soul in... I lit a match with trembling fingers. I touched the flame to the fabric. The fire spread quickly, licking furiously at the fibers. The flames rose bright, orange, hungry, and slowly transformed that symbol of faith into black ash. I stood there, watching until everything turned to dust. It felt like I had burned more than an object. It felt like I had incinerated a piece of my identity. I went back inside and lay down on the thin mattress, the same one where, years before, I had slept, lulled by prayers. Now, sleep was a distant enemy. My eyes remained open in the darkness, staring at the ceiling as if searching for some sign. I thought of death, not as we thought of it in Hamas, with its promises of glory, of immediate paradise, of eternal honor. I thought of it as something cold, empty, an end where there was no light on the other side. If Allah didn't exist, then everything I had done, every sacrifice, every drop of blood I had shed or witnessed, including that of my own daughters, would have been useless, a cruel waste of life. And yet, in that seemingly endless darkness, something different was present. A subtle impression, a whisper. It didn't come as an audible voice, nor in Arabic, nor as a memorized verse. It was more like longing for something I had never known, but which my soul longed to find. I didn't know then that God sometimes allows us to descend to the depths of the abyss not to punish us, but to empty us of everything that prevents us from seeing Him. I didn't know that He allows us to go through our personal hell so that, in the deepest despair, our souls finally cry out for something real. All I knew was that I had lost the only faith I had ever known, and I had absolutely nothing to replace it. But even so, God was already drawing near, and it was in this dark valley of my existence that He began to move. He would soon send me a strange man, a face I had never seen, but who would bring words of hope. Words about a God completely different from anything I had heard before. In the memory that followed, I was no longer alone. We were all home. Amina was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with that calm demeanor that always brought me peace. The girls played in a corner, their laughter filling the room with pure joy. Their laughter felt like music, the kind that touches your soul. A simple yet precious moment, and it's curious how life can change in the blink of an eye. Some days are marked like scars, days that divide our history into before and after, and that day began with a sound, no ordinary sound, footsteps. Several, heavy, fast, pounding hard on the dry earth around the house. Voices came soon after. They were shouting. The words were raw, cutting, full of fury. At first, I thought it was just some fight, the kind of brawl you see in markets, where tempers flare over almost nothing. But then came the knocking. 3 brutal knocks against the door. Amina froze. He dropped what was in his hands. My heart leaped in my chest and then seemed to stop. "Usman!" a voice shouted from the other side. It wasn't an unfamiliar voice. It was familiar, but not friendly. It was the voice of someone who knew me and hated me. I tried to move, but there was no time. The door was smashed inward with a crash. They didn't wait for an answer. They stormed in. Men I'd grown up with whom I'd shared meals, missions, prayers, but there was something different in their eyes. They were blazing, filled with a fire I no longer understood. One of them grabbed me by the collar and slammed me against the wall. Another yanked my wife away from the girls. And then, my daughter screamed, a scream that cut through the air but was swallowed by the chaos. It was the end of something. I just didn't know what yet. "You betrayed us." The sentence came like a bitter spit, laden with contempt. Before I could even fully comprehend the words, I felt a violent blow to my cheek. The metallic taste of blood spreading across my mouth was the first sign that the world had turned upside down. My legs buckled. I fell to the ground, trying to get up, but failed. The true horror was yet to come. 2 men held my daughters, and my heart leaped in my chest. Running, snatched, I reached for them, despair tearing at every fiber of my being. But a boot pressed against my back, crushing any hope of action. Amina cried, begged, promised anything but the life we were building, anything but the legacy that was being ripped from us. But there was no bargaining. The only reason was clear. Do you want to walk with the enemy? Then you will see what happens to those you love. I didn't fight. I wish I could say I did. I wanted to grab my daughters and run, but I failed. I couldn't do anything. They were taken, and the world around them turned to darkness. The sun was cruel that day, shining as if nothing were about to break. The neighbors crowded together, watching in silence. No one moved to help, and then came the shovels. The sound of digging was a death-hammering sound. My fingers dug into the ground, my nails scratching the cold earth as I writhed, begging their names. "Baby! Baby!" Childish voices that bled in my chest. Suddenly, everything stopped. The scream from the ground, the footsteps, the noises, but inside me, something shattered, something that would never be reunited. I don't remember the details that followed clearly. I only know that after they were gone, they withdrew. My wife threw herself at me, sobbing so hard I thought she might break me completely. I tried to dig a path to them, my hands digging into the ground, bleeding, but silence came. Emptiness. Too late, too long. Sitting in the corner of our house, covered in dirt, dust, and blood. My blood. I felt something die inside me. It was the man I recognized in the mirror. It was the fighter. It was the Muslim. Everything silenced. But then, a seed of a question emerged, germinating in the darkness. If God exists, where was he? I didn't know at that moment that this question would be the beginning of a journey, but it was there, on that cold ground, that God began to gently move in my broken heart. Later, we were taken to the burial site. The smell of the earth was dry, heavy, with a hint of dying grass, a fragrance that lingers and stays with you, even after you leave the place. We walked for a long time until we reached the clearing, my feet moving on their own, even though I was weak. Inside, I felt as if I had been dead, soulless, existing on autopilot. Ahead of me, 2 men were digging graves, the sound of shovels piercing the earth. Thud, scrape, lift, thud, scrape, lift, became a macabre song that would echo for years. I could barely breathe. The air felt thick, almost solid. My hands shook so badly that I clenched them into fists, as if trying to contain an explosion. The graves were too shallow, as if there wasn't enough space in the world to protect 2 such pure girls. Girls who once ran barefoot, laughing and spreading joy in the yard. All the world could offer them was that dry hole. I barely knew if I was still breathing, but I remained there, staring at the ground where everything had crumbled. My mind seemed to conspire against me, endlessly replaying every little memory of my daughters. I could smell the sweet scent of their hair, still wet from their bath, and how those fragile little hands gripped my finger with a strength that seemed to say, "Here, with me, I'm safe." I vividly remember the way they fell asleep together in my lap, entwined, as if sharing a silent secret, lulled by soft, rhythmic breaths that felt like a lullaby I wanted to hear forever. As the scene played out in my mind, an inner voice told me they should be in their beds, dreaming of good things. Not here, not like this. Across the way, the men digging the earth around me didn't even glance at me, and I doubted they were able or even willing to look at my pain-ravaged face. Perhaps, at that moment, my suffering was too brutal a truth for them to bear. When they brought in the wrapped bodies, I stood still, paralyzed. The sight hit me with the force of a punch to the gut, making my knees nearly buckle. There they were, wrapped in white cloths, carefully tied at the head and feet. The delicate, defenseless contours of their small bodies impossible to mistake. The world seemed to have stopped. Even the birds, which had previously been singing, fell silent, as if respecting the heavy silence of that moment. I wanted to tear that cloth away, hug them again, press my face against theirs, and tell them they weren't allowed to leave me, that they still needed me. But something froze inside me, a strange, cruel instinct that knew if I touched them, I would never be able to let them go again. They laid them side by side in the grave, as if they were still only sleeping, and that image seared itself into my mind, never to leave. The silence of the earth was deafening. I expected the tears to come unabated, but at some point they ceased, giving way to a hollow, numb shock that seemed to separate me from reality. A prayer was recited, but the words reached me muffled, distorted, as if I were submerged in water and the sound struggled to reach my ears. My lips didn't even move. My heart felt petrified. As the bodies began to be slowly lowered, a piece of me shattered. Not explosively, but like an old wall that, after years of slow erosion, finally collapses. My chest burned with a crushing emptiness. The sound of the first handful of earth hitting the cloth was unbearable, each thud reverberating like a hammer driven straight into my heart. I wanted to jump into the grave, shield my daughters with my own body, scream to the earth that they didn't belong in that darkness. But my feet were glued to the ground, unable to move. A final sigh of wind lifted the cloth covering the girl's head, revealing a sliver of pale cheek, still marked by a strand of hair stuck to it. The sight broke me completely. I fell to my knees, desperately clutching the edge of the grave, and began to sob in a way I never thought possible. A deep, animalistic sound, born of the purest, rawest pain. Someone pulled me back, I don't know who, but I resisted, clawing at the earth, begging for one more moment, one more touch, one more sign that they were still there. But the earth continued to be thrown at them, and in that instant, I felt my world crumble into silence. When it was all over, the men put away their shovels and walked away. The sun was beginning to set, dyeing the horizon orange and blood red, as if the sky itself were weeping for my loss. I remained there, kneeling, my hands resting on the still fresh earth, trying to feel something, anything, that would tell me my daughters were still present somehow, there with me. I whispered words to them that, honestly, I can't quite remember any. They were disjointed words, full of pain and confusion, but they carried a weight, a promise. I promised I wouldn't let their story die buried in that patch of cold earth. I said I would find the truth, that I would seek the God who could explain why all of this had happened. I promised I would live in a way that one day I could find them again, that our story would continue beyond that grave. The wind carried my voice, scattering my words through the silence of the night. But deep down, I believed that, somehow, they heard. That day marked the end of the world for me. It was the day I stopped being the man I was and became someone different, someone who now carried an invisible grave in my chest. And deep within that grave, a question began to grow. A question that would drag me down paths I had never imagined. A question capable of destroying the faith I had been given since birth. But at that moment, that question would have to wait. Because, at that moment, I was still sitting on the warm earth, clinging to the last warmth of the sun, and the last vestige of their presence in my life. I couldn't close my eyes. The heat was stifling, but it wasn't the heat of the air that kept me awake. It was the weight pressing down on my chest, the emptiness spreading within me. I lay sprawled on my thin mattress, but my mind was trapped in a whirlwind that wouldn't let me escape. The events of the past few weeks played in my head like a cruel movie, replayed ad nauseum. My daughter's sweet laughter, the screams, the dust kicked up by the chaos, the terrifying silence afterward. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces looking at me, sometimes smiling, other times reaching out, begging for help I could never give. I rolled onto my side, leaning my cold back against the wall, staring at the small wooden window where the moonlight timidly filtered. The night outside was strangely still, as if the world had held its breath. Even the goats that normally roamed the yard were motionless. Only the wind blew slowly, passing through the leaves of the mango tree, a light, almost whispering sound, as if the entire universe were waiting for something I couldn't yet see. I whispered to myself, Ya Allah, why? But this time, my voice broke. It wasn't a cry of rage or accusation. It was a whisper of surrender. I had no words left, no strength to fight. I was an empty shell, a broken man. For the first time in my life, I wondered if he was truly listening. And then something happened that I never expected. At first, I thought it was a dream. I heard a voice. Not an outside voice, not a sound in my ears, but something coming from within, from a deep, hidden place. It wasn't the powerful, booming voice I'd imagined to be God's. It was soft, firm, and carried a calm authority that didn't need shouting to make itself heard. Usman, the voice said, and my entire body froze. My breath caught, my heart raced, and even the blood in my veins seemed to stop and listen. Why do you call me if your heart is so far from me? I sat up slowly, the air around me feeling heavy yet light, as if a great burden had been lifted, and with it, an unexpected. My lips trembled as I answered in a near whisper. Who are you? The answer came clear and simple. I am the one who formed you in your mother's womb. I am the one who saw you before you even took your first breath. I am the one who gave his life for you, so that you might live. My mind raced, refusing to accept it. This can't be true, I thought, remembering the teachings I'd received since childhood that Allah didn't speak this way. But in that instant, a name sprang to mind, a name I'd buried deep, dismissed as a lie invented by Christians. And that name returned, strong and clear, like a flame that refused to go out. My heart raced, nearly leaping out of my chest. I could feel each beat reverberating in my fingertips, a kind of warning that made me shiver. Isa, no, you're just a prophetess, I stammered, my voice trembling, almost in disbelief. But the voice answered with a firmness that left no room for doubt. I am more than a prophetess. I am the path you have silently sought. I am the truth your soul has cried out for in the darkness. And I am the life you believed had been stolen from you. Usman, come with me. Suddenly, the carpet beneath me disappeared, and everything around me dissolved into a deep darkness. In the blink of an eye, I found myself standing in a vast open space with no end in sight. Before me, a blinding light shone with an intensity that, in any other situation, would have burned my eyes. But there was no pain. Instead, that light flooded my being with a peace I hadn't felt in months. A peace so profound, it felt like it touched my soul. I fell to my knees, powerless to move. Tears streamed down my face, hot and relentless. But the voice reminded me, I know who you are, Usman. I know the terrible things you carry, the mistakes you feel you made, how you failed to be there for your children when they needed you most. I know your pain, and I carried it. I carried your shame before you were even born. Your daughters are with me, Usman. They are safe. And if you follow me, you will see them again. In that instant, something inside me broke, but not like before, when tragedy had destroyed me. It was as if an invisible prison had finally opened, releasing something long trapped. The bitterness that had poisoned my heart began to melt, giving way to a gentle warmth that spread through my chest, down my arms, to the tips of my fingers. Then I saw them. Two small figures running toward me, appearing on the horizon like a dream. Their laughter was the same one I knew, but now it held no pain. It was pure and full of joy. They reached me, and I wrapped my arms around them. breathing in the sweet scent of their hair, that scent only a father recognizes and never forgets. I didn't want to let them go. The voice, now gentle, spoke again. They are mine, but they are also yours. Your time has not yet. I have a mission for you, Usman. The story we will write together will bring many people. The light slowly began to fade, and my daughter's little hands slipped from my arms, not out of sadness, but as a silent promise of reunion. I opened my eyes and was back in my room, small and dimly lit, but the air around me felt different, lighter, softer. The crushing weight on my chest had lifted. My tears still fell, but now they weren't tears of despair. I lay on the carpet, staring at the ceiling as I whispered a name I'd never dared to utter in prayer before. Isa Almasi, I will follow you. That night, something new was born within me. I still didn't understand everything, nor did I know what following this path would cost me. But one thing I was certain of, my life would never be the same. For the first time in many months, I closed my eyes and slept peacefully. Night had already fallen, but my body refused to rest. I sat in a corner of my room, my knees drawn up, my back against the cold wall. Outside, the world was eerily silent, so silent that even the sound of crickets seemed to have vanished, as if nature itself were holding its breath. My mother's voice came to me, distant and faint, bringing back memories of her words about the hours before dawn, a time when God would be closer to the human soul. In that moment, I realized I no longer knew who I was listening, nor what God I truly believed, but something inside me had already begun to change forever. The silence that enveloped me was dense, almost suffocating, like a heavy cloak pressing against my chest, not out of fear, but out of a strange, profound anticipation. The pain of the past few weeks, the loss that had shattered me, the shame that gnawed at me, the loneliness that seemed eternal, had carved a vast void within, and in that instant, something began to fill that abyss. Slowly, I closed my eyes, and in the darkness behind my eyelid, I saw a faint light. It wasn't bright or blinding, but a soft, persistent glow, like the embers of a fire that refuses to die, burning silently and tirelessly. With this light came a whisper, so subtle that at first I thought it was just the echo of my own thoughts returning to me. But it wasn't my voice. It was soft, laden with an indescribable weight, tender, yet firm, unwavering. I'm here. I froze, my breathing slowed, and every fiber of my body stiffened, trying to absorb that message. I've always been here. A tremor ran through my soul, not fear, but a deep recognition, as if something inside me had been eagerly awaiting those words for a long time. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and silent. I wanted to speak, to ask who it was, to demand proof, but my lips remained still. I didn't need words. In that moment, I knew. It was the same presence that visited me in childhood dreams, the same voice that warned me of imminent danger, the warmth I felt the day I nearly drowned and was pulled ashore by a stranger whose face I'd never seen. It was him. The room around me seemed to fade, the peeling paint on the walls, the smell of dust, the distant barking of a dog in the night. Everything seemed to fade before that overwhelming presence. It was like being at the center of a vast ocean of light. Even with my eyes closed, the whisper returned, softer now, like a caress to the soul. I called you by name. You are mine. Something inside me broke in a way words cannot describe. I didn't just cry. I gave in to a deep sob, releasing years of anger, guilt, doubt, and self-loathing that consumed me in ragged sobs. I hunched forward, pressing my forehead against the cold floor, and for the first time, I didn't care if anyone heard me. Through my tears, I whispered, "If you are real, don't let me go." The silence returned, but this time it was different, not empty, but alive, charged with meaning. In that sacred moment, I knew my life had entered a path from which I could never escape. I have no idea how long I lay on that cold ground. Outside, the world still slept in darkness, but there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the night were holding its breath, waiting. My chest rose and fell in shallow waves, each movement sending sharp shocks through my aching ribs. My lips were cracked, and a persistent metallic taste filled my mouth. I thought I might be dying. My eyes felt heavy, almost giving way with exhaustion. But then something began to happen. It wasn't sleep, nor any ordinary dream. It was as if the air around me began to thicken, enveloping my skin with a gentle pressure, like invisible hands carefully holding me. The shadows in the room began to move, not erratically or frightening, but with purpose, almost conscious. I held my breath, fearing that any movement would make them disappear. And then I saw him. No door opened, no footsteps echoed. One moment, the corner of the room was empty. The next, it was filled with a light that came not from the fire, not from the sun, but from something even softer, warmer, and yet infinitely more powerful. It was a presence that filled the space with peace and awe, a silent miracle, a promise that I would never be alone. The light didn't offend my eyes, though it was more intense than anything I'd ever seen. Amidst that radiant glow, the figure of a man appeared. His robe was white, but unlike any ordinary fabric I could imagine. It seemed alive, made of threads of pure light that seemed to pulse and move gently around him. His face wasn't the kind of beauty you find in paintings or sculptures, something superficial or idealized. It was a beauty deep, real, and imposing. There was such pure kindness in his eyes that it immediately made me want to kneel before him. But at the same time, his presence emanated such a firm authority that it seemed capable of ordering the very seas to stop moving. In an instant, I knew exactly who he was. Usman, he spoke, and his name fell from his lips with such ancient ease, as if it had been spoken since before I was even born. And it wasn't just the sound that echoed in my ear, but a vibration that penetrated to my very bones, touching every scar, every wound, every broken piece within me. My first impulse was to look away, feeling the weight of my blood-stained hands, not just from that terrible night, but from my entire life before that moment. I thought of the lies I'd told, the anger I'd harbored, the mockery I'd directed at those who spoke his name with faith. But he stepped closer, and the shame that threatened to crush me began to dissolve before his presence. "I saw your tears," he said softly, and in that instant, my body fell to my knees, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of the sacred moment I was. "I am the first and last," he continued. "I died, but now I am alive forever." I wanted to speak, but my lips wouldn't obey. In my mind, questions screamed silently. Why me? Why now? Why after all I've done? Then he extended his hand, unhurried, with absolute calm, and a certainty that brooked no doubt. When his fingers touched my shoulder, I felt something that went far beyond the skin. I felt every invisible wound, that pain no doctor could heal, begin to close. "You are mine," he said firmly, and in that moment, the room disappeared around me. I stood in a field unlike anything I had ever known on earth. The grass was such a vibrant green that it made the most fertile lands seem faded and lifeless. A crystal-clear river flowed nearby, its sound a charming blend of laughter and music intertwined, like a song of hope and peace. But what truly captured my eyes was the light, more intense than the sun, yet not scorching. This light spilled over everything, filling the shadows, caressing every leaf and flower with a gentle touch. I looked at him, and he smiled. Not the distant smile of a stranger, but the welcoming smile of someone who had waited patiently for a long time. "Go," he said, his voice firm and full of love. "Tell them what I did for you. Tell them I'm alive." And then, suddenly, it was all over. I returned to my room, lying on the cold floor, the air still, the shadows motionless. But something inside me was different. The pain in my body was still there, but it no longer overwhelmed me. The crushing weight on my chest was gone. For the first time in my life, I knew, without a doubt, that I was no longer alone. I tried to stand, and though my legs trembled, I managed to brace myself against the wall. My hand reached the spot where he had touched my shoulder, and I could still feel the warmth of that sacred touch. I didn't have all the answers, nor did I know which path I would take from, but one thing was clear to me. Any life I had before that night was over. Something had come to an end, and something completely new, something eternal and purposeful, was just beginning. That was the night my true story began to be written. The waves that night didn't roar or crash against the shore. They merely whispered, a soft whisper, almost a secret shared with anyone who would listen. It was as if the sea knew something I couldn't yet comprehend, a silent mystery shrouding everything around me. I had come here to be alone, trying to find some space for a mind at war with itself. Inside, my ancient prayers battled with the doubts that insisted on taking over the present. The moonlight spilled its silvery light over the surface of the water, making it glow with an almost supernatural calm. The cool wind carried the salty scent of the ocean mixed with a sense of mystery, as if the world were waiting for something I couldn't yet see. It was then that I saw it. A man, standing at the water's edge, ankle-deep in the tide, staring intently at the endless horizon. He didn't turn when I approached, and he didn't turn when my footsteps on the soft, crunching sand announced him. It was as if he already knew I was coming. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said without taking his eyes off the horizon. His voice was calm, deep, carrying the quiet strength of someone who had faced storms and emerged from them alive. I hesitated before answering, almost surprised by his calmness. "Yes, it is." We stood there in silence, the waves lapping at our feet with a steady rhythm, as if marking the rhythm of that moment. After a moment, he slowly turned to me, and that was when I was able to look into his eyes for the first time. They weren't the eyes of a stranger. They were eyes that seemed to unravel everything inside me, every layer of pride, every bit of pain I'd accumulated. "Your heart is heavy," he said, with a certainty that needed no confirmation. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. How do you know?" He gave a weak, almost sad smile. "Because I once carried that same weight." At that moment, something inside me broke silently. The sea breeze became colder, sharper, as if the wind also felt the weight of that encounter. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he walked closer until he was just a few steps away and held out his hand. "I am someone who knows who you have been running from." My heart raced. My breath felt short. Every part of me wanted to flee into the shadows of the beach, try to forget that presence. But her voice held my soul firmly in place, as if she knew this moment had been written long before I was born. "You came here seeking peace, but true peace is not found in the silence of the sea or the stillness of the night. Peace is found only..." Before I could answer or ask any other questions, he slowly turned and walked back into the water. The waves rose, reflecting the moonlight, and soon he disappeared among them, as if he had never been there. I don't quite remember how I got home that. All I remember is the sound of my heart pounding in my chest, and a strange, new and vivid flame burning silently. Sleep was slow to come, and when it finally came, it came like a storm, chaotic, intense, and relentless. I found myself in a strange place, a vast, endless desert. The hot, dry air scratched my skin, and the wind carried grains of sand that stung my face. The sun blazed above me, making each breath more difficult than the last. I walked for hours that seemed eternal. No shade, no water, just the steady sound of my heart and the crunch of sand beneath my feet. And then, in the middle of that vastness, a figure dressed in white walked toward me. The light surrounding him was so intense that I had to shield my eyes with my hand. But strangely, the closer he came, the cooler and softer the air became, and the ground felt soft and welcoming. I wanted to speak, but my throat was too dry to make a sound. Still, he knew. He always knew. He stood before me, a powerful presence, yet gentle and full of love. His eyes, oh, his eyes. They weren't like the man on the beach. They were deeper, as ancient as time itself, and at the same time they welcomed me like a safe home. "You're thirsty," he said, without judgment, just compassion. I nodded, unable to say a word. Then he touched his cloak and brought out a cup full of water, clear, pure, unlike anything I had ever seen. He held the cup out to me. "Drink," he ordered softly. The moment the water touched my lips, everything changed. The desert disappeared. The heat, the thirst, the weight of the world vanished as if they had never existed. I was in a garden. The air exuded life. Flowers bloomed where before there had been only dust. And I felt whole, truly alive for the first time in a long time. I looked at him, and he smiled. "Follow me," he whispered. But before I could take a single step, I woke. The sound of the waves had faded, and the darkness of my room enveloped me. Yet the taste of that water, that promise of life, still lingered on my tongue.